Welcome anatomy students, and today we're going to be looking at chapter 7, and I'm going to break that into 2 lectures. So we're going to be looking at the skeletal anatomy. Let me get started. All right, as we begin chapter 7, I've broken this up into 2 sections, and the first section will be looking at the axial skeleton. Right, as we study skeletal system, remember that your skeleton is not only just the bones, but you're looking at the cartilage, the joints, and ligaments that hold that whole skeleton together. So the first part, we're going to be breaking that skeleton into 2 parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So this week we'll be looking at the axial skeleton, and then next week we'll look at the second half, the appendicular skeleton. But when we look at that skeleton overall, it is mostly composed of bone. And the skeleton itself does compose about 20% of your body mass. So there is cartilage in isolated areas of the skeleton, but also don't forget the ligaments. And those ligaments are where bones connect to bones. And that is going to be different from the tendons. That's where your muscles connect to the bones. And we'll study those when we get to the muscular system. And then of course, we'll do a separate chapter on joints. That's chapter 8. So we'll get to those separately. So the axial skeleton, that comprises of 80 bones, and they're divided into 3 different major regions. We'll look at the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. So pretty much you'll have to memorize all 80 bones. There's not much that we skip over. And so this is where your memorization skills really come into play. Okay? You'll have to memorize pretty much all the bones of the skull, all the vertebra, and all the ribs. Okay? So luckily all the ribs pretty much have the same name, so not too much to memorize, but you do want to start working on those memorization skills as you learn the bones of the skull and the vertebra. So when we look at the axial skeleton, it's a really vital part to the whole skeletal anatomy because it's forming that axis of the body and it's supporting the head, the neck, and trunk. And most important of all, it's protecting your brain, spinal cord, and all those thoracic organs that are inside the chest. So think of your lungs and your heart. And here we have both the anterior and posterior view of the entire human skeleton. And you'll see that the axial skeleton is in blue, whereas the appendicular skeleton is in more of this tannish color. So you can see the skull, the vertebral column, and the ribs over to the side. So let's first start with the skull, and that is definitely the most complex part, and it's broken into 2 parts. We have the cranial bones versus the facial bones. So when we look at the cranial part, this is the posterior part of the head. Okay? And kind of a part to remember, pretty much whenever you're dealing with the head, a lot of those words begin with C. So cranium, cephala, cerebellum, cerebrum, pretty much that has to do with your head or your brain. So when you're looking at terminology, when it begins with a C, usually it's going to have something to do with the head or the brain. So kind of remember that when you're memorizing your terminology, okay? So it's containing the cranial cavity, and it has all the attachments for the neck muscles. So whenever you're looking at all of these different protuberances and things like that, that's muscle attachment. So remember in the last chapter, when we were looking at skeletal tissue, we had to memorize all those terms. Well, this is where all those terms of skeletal features come into play. So you wanted to remember, well, you know, this was a stylus. Well, later on, we're going to learn what muscle attaches to that. And whenever you memorized all those terms early on, you know, now you know that this is a ramus and you know that this is a condyle. Well, now when we go to memorize those bones and you have to memorize this exact term, knowing the names of those types of structures, it'll make it a whole lot easier, okay? So keep that in mind as we move forward. So all of these sites will basically offer attachment to those head and neck muscles. All right, then the front part are the facial bones. That's what makes up your face. Okay, so the framework for the face, and then it has a whole bunch of different cavities, more so than other parts of your body, because those are the cavities that allow for your special senses, your sight, your taste, your smell, openings for air and food passages, containing your teeth, anchoring all those important facial muscles. So there's a lot more going on. Your skeletal muscles in your face are a lot more complex, and the bones within your head are a lot more complex compared to the rest of your body. Most of the bones in your head are flat. Remember we talked about the different types of bones, your flat, your long and short bones, etc. So most of those within the skull are flat bones, and they lock together using those sutures. So there's joints, and all the joints are held together with those sutures. And remember, they have that sawtooth appearance. So we looked at that in the last chapter. So those joints are sutures, and most of the bones are going to be flat, except for the mandible. That would be called irregular. And when we look at the geography of the skull, remember the facial bones form the anterior aspect. So those are all the facial bones. Then we have back here in the posterior, those are the cranium, and this is the cranial vault, which contains your brain, and then you have the cranial base right here, and that's the most inferior aspect of your skull. And then when we look at the frontal area of the skull, you have a lot of cavities. So you have your cranial cavity, you have your orbits, you also have the nasal cavity. Altogether, you have 85 openings within your skull. It's a lot of different openings. And remember all that terminology we talked about in the last chapter. You have your canals, your fissures, your foramina. So these are all different passageways for your spinal cord, your blood vessels, the 12 cranial nerves that we'll get to when we get to the nervous system. So we're going to be learning a lot of these blood vessels and nerves and so forth. But that's why there's so many ins and outs within the skull, all these little holes and passageways that are within the skull. So we'll be learning a lot of these conduits that go in and out of the skull. So that's what makes the skull so complex compared to many of the other bones. So let's start to memorize some of the terms within the skull. We'll start with the cranium first. The cranium has 8 cranial bones altogether, and a couple of them are paired, which makes it a little bit easier. So you've got the frontal bone, which the name implies is the front. That's going to be your forehead. The parietal, which is paired. So that's how you can remember parietal is paired, and that's on the left and right. Okay, so those are going to be the two on either side. Occipital, which is the one in the back. And occipital, OC, that always refers to your vision. So the center of your brain, which is important for vision, is the occipital lobe of your brain. So anything to do with vision always starts with OC. So that's the part of your brain and the part of your skull that's important for vision. Then you have temporal, and you can remember that because of your temples. Temples are on either side of your brain. And so this is the temporal region right above your ears. And that's also left and right. Then you have these 2 small little bones called the sphenoid and the ethmoid. And let me show you in a picture. So pretty much you have to know everything on this image, okay? A lot of memorization, but breaking it down will help. Okay, so back here, the cranium, here is that frontal bone, here is that parietal, there's the occipital in brown and the temporal in orange. So certainly because they have colored it, that'll be helpful. Those are the easy ones that are real easy to pick out. And using this in visible body, go through visible body and quiz yourself, okay? The smaller ones here, this is the sphenoid bone, okay? And the ethmoid bone is going to be a little harder to pick out. You can see here it's in brown, kind of a orangey brown back here. And I'll show it to you from a different view. It'll be a little bit easier. But this ethmoid bone here is going to be on either side, okay? So I'm going to talk about each one of these. Don't worry about the facial bones right now to the front. Worry about just the cranial bones and how we break each of these apart, okay? So first look at the frontal bone. That's your forehead, okay? The anterior position of the cranium, okay? And it attaches to the parietal bone. And you'll want to memorize these sutures. So how are they connected? Okay, so I'm going to go back for a picture. This suture right here is where it connects to the parietal bone. So that's its neighbor. So right there is where it connects. So that's the suture. And the major markings, you'll want to, the sinus is the main one to think about. And we'll talk about sinuses a little bit later, but that main sinus is one that we talk about. All right, so there it is once again, there's that, and the sinus is what's in front. If you've ever had a sinus headache, it's kind of right above your eyebrows. That's a small indentation in the frontal bone. All right, parietal bones, two major sutures, okay? This is on either side of your head, so on the upper part of your head coming down. And these are the most superior aspects, lateral aspects of your cranial vault. 4 sutures, okay? So it combines, it attaches to the frontal in the front, the occipital in the back, and the temporal on either side. So you have a coronal suture, a sagittal suture. So the sagittal suture is the one in the front. So remember, a sagittal cut cuts you right in half, left and half side. So the sagittal suture is going to be the one that cuts your skull in half. The coronal suture that we just learned about is what cuts it in the crown. Remember, a coronal cut, sagittal cut. So remember that from our very first chapter. Then these other 2 sutures are a little more not as intuitive. The lambdoidal cut is the one in the back, and that's going to cut between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. That's the one in the way back. And then the squamous suture, that one, you don't have to memorize as much. It's a little smaller. I wouldn't worry too much about. But here you go. This one's showing the view of a skull. So this may be a little harder, but it's just a different view for you. So here's that frontal bone. Here's the parietal bone. There's that coronal suture. Then you would see a sagittal suture here. There's that lambdoidal suture because there's your occipital bone in the back, okay? All right, we're gonna move on to the occipital bone. That's the one all the way in the back. So that's the most posterior part of your cranial bone, of your cranial bones, okay? It articulates with the temporal bones on the side and the parietal. And the most important part of the occipital bone is this foramen magnum. That's the large hole that your spinal cord goes through. So that's the hole on the underside of your skull. And on either side of that hole is what's called the occipital condyles. Okay, so I'm going to go back for here. So foramen, remember the word, the hole is called I always say foramen, or a hole is, the hole in a ground is a manhole is foramen. That's how you always remember it, okay? And the word magnum means large. So it's one of the larger holes that we have in our bones and our body. So that's how you can always remember that one, foramen magnum. So it's one of the larger holes that you're going to see in any of the bones in our body. And it's so big because the spinal cord is going through it. And on either side of it, you have occipital condyles. So occipital, because it's part of the occipital bone. And condyles, remember the word condyle means like bony protuberance. I always think of condyles look like a little knuckle. And so there's 2 little knuckles on either side of this big hole. And that's actually a really important feature because that's what holds the first vertebra to the skull. So that's really important, a really important feature to know of the skull, and one of the important ones you should really memorize. Okay, so the foramen magnum and occipital condyle. So let's take a look at our posterior view. So here's that sagittal suture, parietal bones on either side. There is your occipital bone. And down here, that's your foramen magnum, and there's your occipital condyles. Okay, let's see if we have, I think I have another view coming up. Okay, then you have your temporal bones on either side. And the temporal bones right above, that's basically your ear. And once again, think of your temples. And there's, this is probably one of the more intricate of all the cranial bones. You have the zygomatic process. So that's kind of your cheekbone, beginning of your cheekbone, and your external auditory meatus. So external meaning outside, auditory meaning your ear, think of hearing, and meatus, remember it's like a meatier hole, like a bigger hole. Okay, so that's your external ear canal. So that's really important to remember. That's one that'll come up again and again, because when we get later on, when we go to study special senses, that will come up again, okay? Over here, the zygomatic process will also articulate with the jaw joint. So these are important things to remember, the zygomatic arch and the temporal mandibular joint. So those are important parts to remember of the temporal bones. So here is the temporal bone, very intricate. There's that zygomatic process. And here is that external auditory meatus. And then here's another interesting thing on the temporal bone is the styloid process. So it just really goes to show you a lot of intricate detail on this bone. And all of these are attachments for muscles. So when we get to the muscle section, memorizing all of these will really help you because that's where muscle attachment is going to be. And then right here, this mandibular fossa is where we're going to see mandible being attached to when we get to the facial bones, so right here. And this is going to be the temporal mandibular joint. When we go to study joints, that'll be an important joint to memorize. And here's illustration versus the actual bone. So the temporal mandibular joint is right there. So that's where your joint, your jaw is going to attach. Okay. Then the sphenoid bone is a really interesting bone because it's the one bone they call the keystone bone because it actually articulates with all the other bones, but it's more internal. So the other important thing about the sphenoid bone is that it has a little depression or a fossa that holds our pituitary gland, which is a very important gland that we'll get to when we get to the endocrine system. But it has this little pocket that holds the pituitary gland. So once again, you should be really familiar with pretty much everything on this illustration. I bring that up, but I believe, okay, here is the image of the sphenoid bone. And as this cutaway image, so you can see this is your temporal bone, back here is your occipital bone, and, or sorry, your frontal bone here. Back here is the occipital bone, over here is the parietal bone. So you can just see how everything is connected with the sphenoid bone, how everything connects up. It's basically holding all of those bones together. So it's just, it interlocks. It becomes that keystone bone, from locking it from above and below. So by the way, here is the foramen magnum that I referred to earlier. So there's the occipital bone, and there's the foramen magnum that your spinal cord is going to go through. So once again, frontal bone, temporal bones, and then the parietal bones would be on top. I think I said that wrong before. Then lastly is the ethmoid bone. That is the deepest bone of all of the cranial bones. And it's a little harder to point out, but it basically is between the nasal cavity and the orbits. So it's basically right here, not to be confused with the nasal bone, but it's this bone right here. So this is the frontal bone, And then it's this little bone right here that sits in between the eyes and the nose. And it's this small bone right here. It's very delicate, but as the last bone of the cranium. Okay. So there it is right there is the ethmoid bone. Once again, a better look at the sphenoid bone, and you can see once again how it connects the occipital bone and the temporal bone, and above the parietal bones and the frontal bone. All right, so that was all of the cranial bones. That's the back of the skull. Now we're going to move forward to the facial bones. And here we have 14 bones altogether. And 12 of them are paired, so that helps out a little bit. And you've got your mandible, which is your lower jaw, so that's easy to remember. Then you've got your maxilla, which is the main face bone. Okay, that's the one, your upper jaw. There's one on the left and right. Your zygomatic bones, which are your cheekbones. Your nasal bone, as you would guess, is your nose bone. Lacrimal bones, those are the ones right near your tear ducts. Your palatine bones, also near your nose, we'll talk about those. And your vulvar, which are in your nose, a lot of intricate bones, and then also the nasal conch. So let me show you in a picture, okay? So we've got the mandible bone right there. There is the main maxilla bone. So that's, you can think of your upper jaw. There's your zygomatic bone in blue, okay? There is your nasal bone in the dark blue, okay? Then we have some smaller bones. Okay, there's the sphenoid bone, last one. Here is the lacrimal bone, and that's in green, okay? And I know I'm forgetting some here. Oh, down here is the vulvar, that's in the nose, and the inferior conch is this one right here in the nose as well. Okay, so let's go through each one of these. The mandible is definitely the strongest bone in your face. That's holding your lower jaw. It's really responsible for a lot of chewing. It's got a lot of a muscle attachment. So that's why it's so strong. And some major markings on this one that you want to memorize. It's got the ramus, which is the arm, and it's got the condyle process. This is where the temporal mandibular joint is right here. And so that's an important part to remember, because when we get to joints, we'll be talking about that, okay? So that's the temporal mandibular joint right there that we'll be studying later on when we get to joints. All right, then there is the maxilla, the maxillary bone, and that one is the facial keystone bone. All the other bones articulate with that, so it's the equivalent of the sphenoid bone. And its major markings, that zygomatic process is really important to remember, and the maxillary sinus. Once again, we'll get to the sinuses a little bit later in this chapter, but that's important to remember. Okay, and there's a close-up of the maxilla that you can see. So it's holding the upper teeth. That's an important thing to remember there. All right, moving on, we've got the zygomatic bones. So those are your cheekbones. It's an irregular shaped bone, and it has the zygomatic process that connects up with the temporal bone. So the temporal bone reaches out across and then matches up that zygomatic process, attaches onto the cheekbone. Then you have the small little nasal bones that make up the top of your nose, or the bridge of your nose, basically, that your glasses rest upon. So remember, the main part of your nose, the tip of your nose, is cartilage, but the base of your nose is made of those nasal bones. That's forming the bridge of your nose. Then the lacrimal bones, okay, that is the inside of your eye, okay, or your orbits. And this is where your lacrimal glands or tear ducts are. So that's how you can remember. The word lacrimal refers to tears. And when we get to special senses and we learn about your eyes, you'll understand that the lacrimal gland is responsible for your tears. So that's how you can remember the lacrimal bones. That's where your tear ducts are located. So that's how you can remember that one. So the small little bone that lines the inside of your eye, the medial side of your eye, your orbit. So just a refresher there, that's the lacrimal, and that is the maxillary, and there we've got the zygomatic. Okay, let's finish up with those last couple ones. We have the palatine bone. This one makes up the hard palate, so that's going to be your upper jaw. So this is the hard palate, and it also is making up the bottom part of your nasal cavity and a small little part of your orbits. So kind of all of that inside part. And then there's the volar, which is a small little bone that makes up your nasal septum. So think of that V section between your nostrils. And then another small little bone, the inferior nasal conch. This is a paired set of bones in between the nasal cavity and basically making up the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Okay, so here we'll kind of go from the underside. Okay, so this is the maxilla. And then down here, that's going to be the palatine bone. Then over here, that's the volar. Okay, that makes kind of a better view. And by the way, I didn't have this view earlier, but there is your occipital condyle, sorry, your foramen magnum, and there are your occipital condyles, those little bumps on either side of the foramen magnum. Okay, this is a better view here of the different bones. So very intricate. So there's the nasal bone. Okay, oops, sorry. And you can see each of these bones making it up. So there's the palatine bone. There's the volar making up that. And you can see some of these sinuses, by the way. There's the sphenoid sinus. This is where that pituitary gland was made up before. I was talking about how the pituitary gland is held by the sphenoid bone. Okay. And this is the ethmoid bone held right by there. Okay. And this is the volar bone. And let's see, let's move on here to the orbit. And we can see right here, this is the zygomatic bone. This right here is, this is the sphenoid. And which one is this one over here? We've got also part of the sphenoid, and right over here is the part of the nasal bone, but right here is the lacrimal bone. You can see that's just a small part of that one. So each one of these creating part of the orbit, and then each one of them creating part of the eye. All right, now we're going to move on to sinuses. And with the sinuses, these are basically small little depressions and air pockets within the bones. And they're basically mucus-lined, air-filled sacs within the 5 different bones. And they basically lighten the skull a little bit, and they allow for resonation of our voices. They can become infected if you've ever had a sinus headache, or sometimes if you ever have a sinus infection. But the way you can memorize them is by basically where the bones are. So you have the frontal sinus, ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, and the maxillary sinus. So if you've ever had an infection, you may have felt that sinus pressure above your eyes, or maybe right here under your eyes, like near your nose. And so that's basically the function of them. So those are all the bones within your skull. And I would say definitely focus on the bigger ones. And in lab, we'll talk about how to do the different identification. So definitely focus on some of those main features that I talked about, and definitely all of the ones of the cranium, the bigger ones of the facial bones to memorize. Okay. Moving down our axillary skeleton, not to forget about the hyoid bone. Okay. It's not a bone of the skull, but it's one to remember because there's a lot of muscle attachment. It's just, it lies interior to the neck, but just below the mandible. And it actually doesn't articulate with any other bone in the body, but it anchors all these ligaments, and it's important for speech, it's important for swallowing. So it's right under here, and it's a important part of the bone because, like I mentioned, it's kind of attached to the tongue and helps with all of that swallowing and important part of the body. All right, let's move down to the vertebral column. So we've got this whole stack of vertebra and extending from the skull all the way down to the pelvis. Whether you call it the vertebral column, the spine, or spinal column, it's basically transmitting weight from your upper body all the way down through your limbs. It's protecting the spinal cord, and it's got all this great muscle attachment and moving your body. And it's not just straight up and down, it's got this interesting curvature, and there's 26 bones altogether, and has broken down into 5 different regions. So you will need to know all those regions, and you'll need to know the different number of vertebrae within each of those regions. So some easy ways to memorize those regions. We've got cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx. Cervical vertebra, the word cervic means neck. So that's how you can remember that part. This is going to be the first part, and it basically makes up your neck. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. So when you think of cervix, and we think of cervix in our body, the cervical vertebra refer to the neck. We think of cervix of the uterus, that's the neck of the uterus. So cervical means neck. And there's 7 cervical vertebrae. Thoracic means chest. So when we think of the thoracic cavity, that means chest. And remember, we learned earlier in a video, you can think of Thor has a big chest, so you can think of that, okay? And there are 12 in the thoracic vertebra. And then lumbar, and I always think of lumbar, a chair has lumbar support, and it's usually down low. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae. So I've always heard of, you think of meal times, like breakfast is at 7 a.m., and lunch is at noon, and dinner is at 5 p.m. I know that doesn't work for college students because you guys definitely don't eat dinner at 5 p.m. And I know you never wake up at 7 a.m. for breakfast. So think of maybe how your grandparents eat their meals, 7 a.m. and 12 noon and 5 p.m. So remember those meals. So 7, 12, and 5. Then you have these last 2, sacrum and coccyx, but those are all fused. So sacrum is fused into 1 bone, and there's 5 bones altogether, and they articulate with the hip. And then you have coccyx, which is 4 fused bones, and that makes your tailbone. So let's look at each of these and how they're different and how you can be able to tell them apart, because that'll be one of your goals. So we can look at how they're curved and how they articulate together. So there's basically 4 different curves within your spine. So here are your cervical, there's your thoracic, there's your lumbar, and there's your sacral and coccyx. And as I mentioned, those are all fused together. So you'll notice that it curves first, there's a concave, and then a convex, and then a concave again, and then a convex. So it kind of has this S-shaped curve as you go down. So first, how it curves, posteriorly, and how it curves back and forth, and that allows for better support in our body. We also want to look at the ligaments and how those ligaments help support the vertebral column. There are anterior and posterior ligaments that help support, and those are continuous bands that run basically along the front and back of the spine, and they prevent from this hyperextending of the bones. And also we want to look at the intervertebral discs. And remember, that's fibrocartilage, so different from the hyaline cartilage that we looked at that's found in most of our body. And the fibrocartilage was different than the other cartilage because it was much thicker. So just like the meniscus that's in between our knees, it's a really thick cartilage that acts as a shock absorber. And it's quite thick, and it's found in between all of our vertebrae. So you can see the intervertebral discs, they're right there, so nice and thick. And here is this ligament that is found. So we've got the ligament that runs posterior along this intervertebral process. Then we also have it running anterior, kind of along the body of the vertebra. And then you also have it in between the interspinous ligament as well. So all of that holds all of the vertebrae together and prevents that hyperextension. All right, when you look at each individual vertebra, you want to be familiar with the terminology and the geography of each individual vertebra. So each vertebra has a body, and that is where most of the weight is in the body. And then they all have a foramen, and that's the hole through which the spinal cord goes through. Then they have a whole bunch of different processes. There's the spinal process, which is the major process on the top. And then they have a transverse process, which are the ones that go laterally on side. Then they also have some smaller processes, but the spinal process and the transverse process are the main way that we identify the different vertebrae. And the shapes in these, the body, the vertebral foramen, spinal process, and transverse process, those 4 features are how we tell if it's a cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebra, and so forth. That's how we can tell which is which. So here is the spinal process. Here are those transverse process. Here is the foramen, and there's the body. So by looking at the shape of the body, the size of this hole, the shape of this spinal process, and these transverse process, that's how I'm going to be able to just pick one up and tell you right away what vertebra it is. Okay, so we're going to go down the vertebra column, and we're going to tell you which type it is. So as we look at this vertebral column, we're going to look at the first part first. So this is your cervical vertebra, the 7 cervical vertebrae. Here they all are. And we're going to look at the process. We're going to look at the body, and we're going to tell, and that foramen, foramen, and we're going to try to tell which is which. Okay. So cervical vertebra, they're the smallest, they're very lightweight, but the body is oval shaped. That's one thing. And except for that last one, the processes are split. They're V-shaped. And I can always remember because cervical has a V in it and its process has a V in it. So that's how you can remember. The foramen is really large. So if you can think about it, it's closest to the head. The spinal cord is still really big coming out of the skull. So the hole has to be really big. So as it's exiting the brain, the hole is really big. The transverse foramen, the ones going out on the side, also have a little hole. And that's because you've got a lot of arteries and veins coming out of the brain. So these arteries need to basically be, the arteries leaving the heart have to supply the brain. So you need a lot of blood vessels supplying the brain. So they need to be able to have a passageway. So that's why they have extra little holes there. And then C7, that last one, has a really tall process. And it's actually the tallest of all of our vertebrae. So that's kind of a landmark. So cervical vertebrae are very unique compared to all the others. This is table 7.2 in your book, and it's very helpful. You should definitely refer to this chart a lot. So here are all those characteristics. Here's cervical vertebra, and here it is, the body, spinal process, the foramen, transverse process. So here's all of that. So the body's oval, the V-shaped process, the vertebral foramen, transverse foramen, have the side ones have little holes in them. So there's all that information, okay? And here's a picture of it. So there's that V, there's that really big hole, here's that oval-shaped body. Here's, we'll get to them later, but there's your thoracic and there's your lumbar. So you can see how the hole looks different, the body looks different, there's pointy, so everything's different. Here's those transverse foramen with little hole, very different, okay? Here it is from the side. So body's not as thick, okay? So you can compare them. Now, the other thing about your cervical vertebrae is that the first two vertebrae that hold up your head are different than all the other vertebrae. You have atlas and axis, okay? So that's your C1 and C2. So you number all your vertebrae with numbers, and you use the letter of the type of vertebra. So cervical vertebra, C1 and C2. So C1 is Atlas, and if you know your Greek gods and all of that, Atlas is, you know, the one holding the earth, and you can think about your head being earth, and Atlas is holding your head. So you can remember an axis, because this is the axis of your body, C2. Okay? Atlas is so unique because it has no body. It's this big hole, because your spinal cord is going through it. And remember those occipital condyles that were on the bottom of your skull next to that foramen magnum, those little bumps? Well, this is what they articulate to. They articulate to these little things here. So that's what carries your skull. And this is what allows your head to go, yes. Okay, that's your atlas. That's your atlas. And then you've got your axis. This is what fits inside the atlas. And it has this little bony thing called a dens. And this is what kind of creates the body of the atlas. They kind of articulate together. And this is what allows your head to go no. So without that, we wouldn't be able to go yes and no. It's kind of an amazing little feature. So this is C2. So that allows this pivot of our body. All right, so that's C1 through C7. Now we are in the thoracic vertebra. So this is T1 through T12. Remember, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. So this is basically where your chest is, okay? Now look at these vertebrae. They're quite different. You'll notice that the spinal process looks different. The body looks different. They're different in many ways. So T1 through T12, they're bigger. The body is heart-shaped. You can remember that because it's where your heart is, right? They're in the chest of your body, your thoracic cavity, and that's where your heart is, okay? They have these little facets on the side that hold the ribs because that's where all your ribs are, okay? The foramen is more circular, okay? So it's just kind of round, it's not oval. It's not as big as it was in the cervical. And the process, that tall process, is really pointy and it points down. So here's that chart again. Here's all those things you need to know, okay? So they hold the ribs, the hole is circular, and the process points down, and the body is much bigger and heart-shaped. Here's the shape. So here you can see it's kind of heart-shaped. See how circular it is? There's that pointy process. And these transverse have these little hooks on them or little holes on them because that's what's holding the ribs. And here you can see how it points down. All right, now we're going to move on to the lumbar. Okay, so lumbar is L1 through L5. And they look quite different right away. You'll notice, wow, how thick they are. Well, the lumbar is supporting all the weight of your body. So now you've got all this weight and they've got to be thick. So that's holding the stress of your body. That's why they're so big, short, thick, and they don't have a lot of processes. So the foramen's kind of triangular. It doesn't really have a big process. It's kind of more hatchet shaped. So here's that chart again, and you can see all those things we talked about. So now the process is much shorter. Transverse process a little thinner. Body is really massive. And you can see that hatchet-shaped process and has really thick muscle attachment at that point. All right, and our last two, the sacrum and coccyx, well, these guys, this is what is fused. So the sacrum is more triangular shaped. There's 5 of them all together, S1 through S5. And this is the coccyx bone is right below it. And this is what's articulating to the hip bones that we'll get to in the appendicular skeleton. And then the coccyx bone, very small little bone all the way down at the bottom. And there's just 3 or 5 of them fused all together. There's really not much function to them. And I've put them here together so you can see it's triangular shaped of the sacral, and then there's the coccyx bone there. So just on the tailbone. So your hips are going to articulate here on this side and this side. So it's your anterior view and your posterior view. All right, and we are on the tail end. We are now getting, no pun intended, we are now getting to the thoracic cage. So now we're going to be looking at the ribs. So this is what's protecting your thoracic cavity, and it's for protecting the lungs and the heart inside. So you've got the ribs and the sternum and all the costal cartilage that is inside as well. So it's supporting also the girdles. So it's supporting the pectoral girdle and also holding up those upper limbs. And a lot of muscle attachment for the neck and the back and chest and shoulders. So when we look at the thoracic cage, you'll notice you've got all the ribs down here. I'll talk about each of those, but we've also got the sternum. But then in blue, this is all of your ribs, sorry, all the costal cartilage. And remember that word costal cartilage. The word costal refers to ribs, because we'll also be memorizing some of the muscles here, and there's a lot of intercostal muscles. So that word costal or coastal refers to the rib area. Okay, so we'll look at the shapes of these different ribs, and I want to point out, you'll notice there's true ribs versus false ribs that include these floating ribs. So you'll notice the number, there's 12 ribs altogether. Okay, and notice kind of where they are. And remember, we talked about the thoracic vertebra. So the thoracic vertebra are the ones that are going to attach these ribs, and that's why they looked a little bit different. And then we'll also look at this sternum as well, and some of the parts of the sternum. Okay, the sternum, also known as the breastbone, it has 3 fused bones altogether, the manubrium, body, and xiphoid process. Okay, and that actually doesn't ossify until you're 40 years old. So it stays kind of cartilage until you get much older. And I'll just go back here so you can see. So it's made up of this manubrium is on top, the body, and then there's that xiphoid process. Once again, that remains cartilage till you get much older. Now the ribs, you've got 12 pairs. So the true attach directly to the sternum via the costal cartilage, okay? Whereas the false attach indirectly via the costal cartilage. And then the floating ribs have no direct attachment, they're just kind of floating. So I'm trying to remember, yes, I have a picture here. So notice here, you've got these first 7. And the costal cartilage, you've got rib, and it goes directly, attaches straight. It's a direct line to the sternum. Whereas here, it kind of has to make a turn. So you can kind of think of that. If you were driving a car, you'd pull directly into the sternum. Whereas here, you'd have to make a turn. So if it has to go indirectly to the sternum, then that's a false rib. So if you happen to make a turn up to that sternum, then it's a false rib. And if you're a floating rib down here, then you're also in the category of a false rib. So the floating ribs and false ribs do not directly connect to that. You have to make it turn, whereas the true rib goes straight into that sternum. Now, if we look at the parts of a rib, we can look at, we've got the top here, you got the head and neck, and then this is the shaft of it, and this is where it attaches to that costal cartilage. All right, and then you can just see, remember I was talking about how the vertebra had that extra attachment, that costal facet, and that's where it attaches right here with some extra ligaments. And that basically is our axial skeleton. So I know it may seem overwhelming. Try not to get too overwhelmed. Definitely, you know, like for instance, as you're breaking down your vertebra, focus on, you know, the numbers and the different sections. You can study it that way. Use visible body to help memorize the parts of the cranium, the parts of the facial muscles. You know, you don't have to focus, you just basically have to know true versus false ribs. You don't have to memorize all those parts of the ribs. That's basically how you would break it apart. So we'll go over in class, we'll do some quizzes on that, but that is the axial skeleton. So next up will be the appendicular skeleton. So thank you guys and enjoy.